Maasai warriors in Africa, they not only milk their cattle, but they bleed them and they consume the blood. And I've not yet been able to find a disease which is particular to the Maasai, but I think eventually this will emerge. It's one of the lovely things about this subject. You know the Bible's right, but sometimes it takes a little while to get the evidence to prove it. But interestingly enough, recently in Britain, there's been a campaign against red meat. And they've been making the point that you must limit the amount of red meat you eat, because they've done research on this, and those who eat very large amounts of red meat have a much, much higher risk of colon and rectal cancer. And so they're suggesting we keep it down to a small amount each day. Now the Jews were very careful. Not only did they bleed the animals when they slaughtered them, but I understand that devout Jews would then take the meat and soak it in water to get as much blood out as possible. So maybe this is the medical reason that the blood should not be consumed. Another one which is interesting, and I've got to be very careful about this, but I stress that I'm not suggesting that you should take to drinking alcohol. But it's interesting. The Muslims forbid it, certain Christian or alleged Christian groups like the Mormons forbid it, but the law of Moses did not forbid the drinking of alcohol. And it said when you want to celebrate, you take money that you want to go off to celebrate before God with all the people of Israel. And there they could buy the things they needed to eat, cattle and sheep and so on for the meat. Why not other fermented drink? Now, I've got to stress, all the medical evidence is clear that alcohol in moderation is actually beneficial. Now, please don't go away and say that our lecture tonight is trying to convince us we ought to start drinking. If you're teetotal, fine. But there have been study after study conducted on this question, and people who drink in moderation live much longer, averaging several years, maybe up to 10 years longer, than people who are teetotal. Maybe it helps us to relax. Certainly, red wine is known to help with the cholesterol problem, so that might be a contributory factor. But the dangers, of course, of high alcohol consumption are well known. I remember talking to a doctor a little while ago, and she was saying, we're on the horns of a dilemma here. If we suggest to people that a little red wine each day will be good for them, they'll deduce that a lot of red wine will be very good for them. And we'll end up with a nation with tremendous hearts, but short livers. So it's a balance. But it is interesting, isn't it? That alcohol wasn't forbidden, and now today, medical research has shown that in moderation, it's beneficial. And of course, you may recall that Paul commended that to Timothy. Use a little wine. You know, a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. Now, I mentioned food poisoning before, and again, the law of Moses is very clear as to how to prevent food poisoning. Now, keep in mind they had no refrigerators, and at this time, Israel, going through the desert initially, but eventually in their own land, was in a warm country, particularly in the summer. So, when the law was written, they could sacrifice a fellowship offering and so on, and they could eat it on the day that it was cooked. They could eat it the next day, but on the third day it had to be burned up. And that was obviously a safe procedure. The point being that in their country the meat was cooked, second day it was still safe to eat, but by the third day there was now a risk that at those temperatures bacteria would be growing on the food and they'd end up with food poisoning. And not only was there a need to ensure they didn't keep food too long, you know, we tend to forget about this today because it's so common. But you may know that historically the spice trade, people sailing to the Far East to collect spices and so on, to bring them back, one of the main reasons for that wasn't just to make the food taste nice, but actually disguise the fact that very often the meat wasn't very good. It had begun to go off, it was going bad, and by using spices, you have to disguise that. Actually, there's some medical research that's shown that some of these spice materials help to prevent food poisoning. So maybe it was a good thing. Now today, of course, we still do that, but we call it a curry. Well, now, do you remember I mentioned earlier about the question of the wood and the pot? Now here's the law about contamination of your larva. When one of these unclean animals or something dies and falls on an article in your larva, you've got to be careful. If it's made of wood, or cloth, or hide, or sackcloth, you can put it in water, you can wash it. But if it's a clay pot, you have to break the pot. So it's quite clear, if it's one of these substances, like wood and so on, you can just wash it, but if it's clay, you have to break it. Well now, why? Well, it's a good question. Why is it? Isn't wood porous? Yes, it is. Just like a clay pot. Now I can understand the clay pot if you've got a liquid which is contaminated with bacteria in the pot pores, then even if you rinse it, maybe later you put some liquid in, milk or whatever, and the bacteria will come out of the pores and contaminate your food. So why is wood, which is also porous, why is that just safe if you wash it? Well, we now know something. Wood is porous, but it contains some natural compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. When I was a boy, you went to the butcher's shop and you had a big block, usually beech wood, and the meat was cut up on that. And at the end of the day, the butcher's boy, he had the job of scrubbing this block, getting it really clean, it was dry, and by the following morning it was safe, of course, to use. It was regarded as just normal, but of course, in Europe certainly, the regulations came in, they decided, no, wood is very crude, it's old-fashioned. We need plastic, plastic's clean and hygienic. Well, it isn't. It is to begin with, but then when you're cutting on it, you get little grooves with your knife and so on, and these then are wonderful shelters for bacteria. And they discovered that if you took swabs from these plastic chopping blocks after they'd been used a while, they were contaminated. They were ideal as refuges for bacteria. So what did we do? We went back to wood, didn't we? Oh, no one would admit they got it wrong. And so the European regulations are that you can now have a chopping board which has chemicals put into the plastic so that it behaves like wood. Now God has given us a wonderful material, it's natural, it's safe, but no one would admit, you see, they got it wrong. So they had to put plastic with this chemical in it called microman, and you can now buy them. This is one of our supermarket chains in Europe, Britain, and you can buy a chopping board, a cutting board, with this material in so that it imitates wood. That tells us a lot, doesn't it, about human nature. Well now, let's just move on. Do you remember when the law was dealing with a man who had an infectious disease? Remember, it said the clay pot had to be broken, but if he touched the wooden article, all you had to do was rinse it. And we now know why. And this is only a few decades old. It's a very recent discovery that wood has this protective effect when you use it for cuts, for chopping boards and so on. But it was incorporated in God's law for the benefit of his people 3,500 years ago. Well now, one of the things that it was interesting, the law of Moses also had laws about houses fit for human habitation. This is an awful picture of dry rot. It's a